A child is crying in the hallway of a school, shoulders hunched, hands covering their face. The sound is small but raw, the kind that carries a history longer than the moment. Most people pass by. It's not cruelty, just habit, a quiet assumption that someone else will step in. But then a teacher pauses. She kneels, lowering herself to the child's level. She doesn't try to stop the crying. She doesn't rush to fix or distract. She simply says, softly, "I see you." The child keeps crying, but something changes. Their breathing slows. The tension in their shoulders eases. The body begins to settle. Nothing dramatic, no breakthrough, but something invisible, something crucial has just shifted deep inside the brain. What actually happens inside the human brain when someone truly listens to you, not just hears the sound of your voice, but sees you, understands you, makes you feel safe in your pain? Is it just emotional relief, a comforting moment of kindness? Or does the brain know it's been heard? And if it does, how? This is not a poetic question, it's a neurological one, because in recent years, neuroscience has begun to reveal something astonishing. The experience of being deeply understood is not just psychologically healing, it's biologically transformative. When someone feels genuinely seen and heard, when their distress is met with empathy instead of judgment, their brain doesn't just feel better, it begins to change. In just a single moment of connection, stress hormones start to drop, inflammatory pathways calm, the brain's internal painkillers, endogenous opioids, activate. Memory systems begin to reframe events, not through isolation, but through relationship. And in people who've experienced trauma, something even more profound can occur. The first fragile stirrings of trust return, all from being heard. Why does this happen? And how can something so subtle, a look, a tone of voice, a few words of presence, reach so deeply into the biology of the brain? That's the mystery. And the answer, as it turns out, is more beautiful and more complex than we ever imagined. Because to feel seen is not just to be witnessed, it is to be regulated from the inside out. And in that small, quiet moment, healing doesn't just begin, it becomes possible. The human brain is not built in isolation. From the very first moments of life, it is shaped by others, sculpted through touch, gaze, voice, and presence. Neuroscience now makes it clear, the brain is a social organ. Unlike other organs, it does not simply develop on its own according to a fixed genetic plan. It requires interaction, connection. The brain of an infant, for example, cannot regulate stress on its own. When a baby cries, its cortisol levels spike rapidly, but those levels begin to fall only when a caregiver responds, not with perfect words, but with warmth, rhythm, and presence. This is called co-regulation. Long before we develop the language to describe our emotions, we rely on others to help manage them. And even as adults, our nervous systems remain wired for this kind of connection. Eye contact activates mirror neurons. A soothing voice releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone. A kind tone, a soft touch, a patient pause. These aren't just gestures, they are neurological events, and they shape the way our brains function at the most basic levels. This need for connection isn't a modern invention, it has deep evolutionary roots. In early human tribes, being seen and heard wasn't just comforting, it was essential for survival. If others didn't notice you, didn't attune to you, didn't respond to your signals, it could mean you were alone, vulnerable, forgotten, and in the wild. To be ignored was, quite literally, a death sentence. Our brains evolved under these pressures. The systems that detect rejection, silence, or disconnection are ancient and powerful. Fast forward to today, and we find ourselves in a paradox. We're more digitally connected than ever before, yet biologically lonelier. Loneliness, research now shows, is more deadly than smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's more predictive of early death than obesity. And at the root of it all is this primal circuitry, a brain screaming to be seen, but met with silence. And here's where the distinction becomes critical. Being listened to is not the same as feeling heard. You can speak your heart out and still feel invisible. Because feeling heard is not about transferring information. It's about what neuroscientists now call limbic resonance. It's a measurable phenomenon to people's brainwaves and heart rhythms synchronizing during deep, empathic connection. It's what happens when one nervous system tunes into another, not just through words, but through tone, posture, rhythm, breath. This resonance calms the stress centers of the brain. It activates regions linked to safety, trust, and memory integration. And when it happens, we don't just understand each other, we regulate each other. In today's world, this kind of resonance is increasingly rare. We scroll, swipe, post, and consume, but we don't attune. The noise is louder, but the listening is thinner. Mental health crises are rising globally. Anxiety, depression, and loneliness are not just psychological states, they are physiological conditions fed by a lack of true connection and trust in institutions, in relationships, even in ourselves is eroding. We live in an era drowning in information, but what we're starved for is attunement, because the human brain doesn't just want to be heard, it needs to feel heard, and when it does, something ancient wakes up, a kind of neural safety that says, you are not alone, and from that moment, healing begins. In 2013, a team of neuroscientists at UCLA made a quiet but profound discovery. They were studying empathy, not as a philosophical idea or a social virtue, but as a neurological event. Using fMRI scans, they asked participants to share emotional experiences with another person and then measured how the brain responded when that person expressed understanding. What they found was startling. When someone felt truly understood, not just heard, but deeply attuned to, two specific brain regions lit up, the insular and the anterior cingulate cortex. These are the same regions activated by the relief of physical pain. In other words, being emotionally validated doesn't just feel comforting, it actually changes the brain in the same way as morphine. The pain is still there, but the sense of aloneness in that pain begins to dissolve. And what mattered most wasn't the exact words used. It wasn't advice or problem solving or cheerful reassurance. It was emotional resonance, the feeling of, you're not alone in this. Even more surprising was what happened in the brains of the listeners. When someone shared a vulnerable story, a moment of fear, grief, or shame, the listeners' pain circuits activated too. Their brain registered the suffering of the other, almost as if it were their own. But then something curious emerged. Alongside this pain circuitry, researchers saw activity in the brain's reward system, the same circuits associated with warmth, bonding, and satisfaction. The implication was extraordinary. Empathy, when safe, mutual, and not overwhelming, feels good. The brain doesn't just tolerate it, it rewards it. This might explain why we feel so drawn to comforting someone we love, or why mutual vulnerability can create intimacy more powerfully than any shared interest or physical attraction. Connection is not just an emotional benefit, it is a biological incentive, and yet, despite this built-in reward, despite the fact that our brains are quite literally wired to attune and soothe one another, we find ourselves living in a world where so few people feel heard. Couples miscommunicate even when they speak for hours. Patients leave therapy or doctor's offices feeling invisible, even after telling their entire story. Trauma survivors often describe the haunting emptiness of saying everything and still feeling as if no one was there. This is the paradox. If being heard is so neurologically powerful, so healing, so natural to the human brain, why is it so rare? Part of the answer lies in biology. Our brains are capable of empathy, but they are also wired for self-protection. When someone expresses intense emotion, especially pain or anger, the listener's nervous system can become overwhelmed. Rather than attune, we instinctively defend. We shut down, intellectualize, offer quick solutions, or subtly turn the focus back to ourselves. The very circuits that could connect us are overridden by fear of discomfort. And this is compounded by culture. We live in a world that prizes speed, certainty, and composure. Listening, real, slow, open listening, has become almost subversive. We are taught to respond rather than reflect, to advise rather than witness. And in many professional contexts, from medicine to law to education, emotional resonance is seen as inefficient or even unprofessional. So something tragic happens. A person reaches out, hoping to be felt, but their distress is met with strategy, logic, or silence. Not because people don't care, but because they've never been taught how to stay in that space of discomfort long enough for connection to emerge. And slowly, people stop trying. They start to believe their pain is too much, that their feelings are unreasonable, that no one will ever truly understand. And so, the most powerful biological healing mechanism we have, mutual resonance, is left unused. The dilemma isn't that we lack the capacity for deep listening. It's that we live in a world that never taught us how to access it or value it as the fundamental human medicine it truly is. When a person doesn't feel heard, not just once, but chronically, something begins to fracture inside, not just emotionally, but biologically. Neuroscience now shows that ongoing invalidation, especially in early life, triggers persistent elevation of cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone. Over time, this heightened stress response wears down the nervous system, reshapes memory, impairs immune function, and disrupts sleep. Meanwhile, oxytocin, the hormone associated with bonding and trust, begins to dwindle, and the amygdala, the brain's fear center, becomes hypersensitive, reacting more strongly to social threats, rejection, or perceived judgment. For children raised in emotionally neglectful environments, these effects can become encoded in their biology. Recent epigenetic studies show that such neglect doesn't just influence feelings, it alters the expression of genes that regulate stress. The result is a brain primed not for connection, but for defense. A life shaped not by openness, but by the expectation that no one will listen. And yet, decades before neuroscience could map these processes, a quiet revolution was already beginning. In the 1940s, psychologist Carl Rogers introduced an idea that, at the time, was considered almost radical. What if therapy wasn't about analysis, or authority, or diagnosis, but about presence? What if healing came not from giving advice, but from offering unconditional positive regard, the experience of being fully seen, accepted, and heard without judgment? Rogers believed that when people are deeply listened to, without being fixed or corrected, something shifts. They begin to access their own insight. Their inner world reorganizes. At the time, his ideas were revolutionary, but neuroscience would eventually catch up. Modern brain imaging confirms what Rogers intuited, that empathic presence and emotional attunement activate neural pathways involved in safety, regulation, and integration. To feel heard, it turns out, is not just comforting. It's reorganizing. It's therapy, even in the absence of words. But this kind of listening is increasingly rare in today's hyper-connected world. We are surrounded by voices, by artificial intelligence, by digital assistants, by chatbots trained to mirror conversation. Even many human therapists, under pressure to diagnose or deliver quick results, can fall into scripts. Technology is getting better at sounding like it's listening, but the human brain knows the difference. Genuine attunement involves an intricate ballet of microsignals, eye dilation, breath synchronization, subtle shifts in posture, tiny changes in tone and timing. These are the nervous system's ancient cues developed over millennia to detect sincerity, safety, and presence. And they cannot be faked. When these signals are missing, something in the body remains guarded. The result is a strange kind of loneliness, the feeling of being surrounded by responses, but untouched by resonance. Compounding this is what researchers now call the silent epidemic, a growing awareness that listening itself, not just speaking, can be impaired. Disorders like misophonia, where certain sounds trigger rage or panic; auditory processing disorder, where sounds are heard but not understood; and trauma-induced dissociation, where attention fragments under emotional strain all interfere with the most basic human need to connect through shared meaning. People with these conditions often struggle not just to feel heard, but to hear others. This creates a devastating feedback loop. Isolation deepens, misunderstanding compounds, even in rooms full of people, even in families, even in marriages. The sense of being truly understood slips further away. What emerges is a culture of disconnection, not from lack of effort, but from lack of skill and awareness. The cost is not abstract. It is measurable in biology, in mental health, in broken relationships and fragmented communities. The nervous system is waiting always for attunement, but more often than not, it is met with noise. And the damage isn't just emotional, it's physiological, cellular, generational. Yet within this dilemma lies a question of profound hope. If the brain can be hurt by not being heard, can it also be healed by finally feeling seen? Can we relearn what it means to truly listen? And in doing so, begin to reverse the isolation that has crept into our most intimate spaces? The science says yes, but it begins not with technology or training or even words. It begins with presence, with slowing down, with remembering that to listen well is not a skill of the ears, but of the entire nervous system. The most profound discovery in recent neuroscience may be this: being heard doesn't just comfort us in the present, it changes how we remember the past. In a series of breakthrough studies, researchers found that when individuals share a traumatic experience and feel genuinely understood during the retelling, something remarkable happens inside the brain. The amygdala, which encodes emotional intensity, begins to quiet. The hippocampus, which organizes narrative memory, becomes more active. The event itself isn't erased, but the emotional charge surrounding it softens. The memory becomes less like a wound and more like a scar, still there, still meaningful, but no longer aching with the same rawness. This process is more than catharsis, it's neurological editing, and it only happens when the speaker feels truly, empathically heard. But the opposite is also true, and far more common. When someone shares a painful memory and is met with dismissal, silence, or subtle invalidation, the brain responds in a deeply defensive way. The amygdala remains activated. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for meaning-making and reflection, shuts down. The memory does not get processed, it gets reinforced. The trauma becomes more deeply encoded, more fragmented, more difficult to integrate. This is why so many trauma survivors say, "I kept telling my story, but it never helped." The healing wasn't in the telling, it was in the receiving. And without that, without true resonance from another nervous system, the brain remains trapped in the original moment of pain. Here lies the twist. Empathy isn't just emotional support, it's neurobiological time travel. When someone listens deeply, without interruption, without judgment, without the impulse to fix, they create a space in which the brain can revisit old pain and reprocess it. This doesn't change the facts of the event, but it changes the meaning attached to those facts. It allows the nervous system to release what was once held in tension. It allows a person to see the story not just through the eyes of the past, but through the presence of someone who stayed, who listened, who bore witness. And in doing so, it allows the past to loosen its grip. In this light, empathy is not just a social nicety or a moral virtue. It is a form of neural repair, a process by which the stories that once fractured us can be retold, restructured, and slowly reintegrated. To feel heard is to reclaim authorship over your own memory, to say, this happened, and I survived, and someone else knows it too. That shared knowing is not small, it's not symbolic, it's a biochemical shift in the architecture of memory. So, perhaps the most important healing doesn't come from advice, or insight, or even time. It comes from presence, from another human being saying, I believe you, and meaning it. And in that moment, the brain finally updates its story. I was alone, and then I wasn't. And that changes everything. Modern neuroscience no longer views empathy as a soft science or a sentimental luxury. It sees it for what it is, a biological event, and a powerful one. When someone feels truly heard, their brain responds in ways that are not only consistent, but remarkably beneficial. Functional MRI studies show that deep listening activates the brain's reward circuits, particularly the ventral striatum and medial prefrontal cortex. These are the same areas that light up with safety, trust, and even pleasure. At the same time, regions like the amygdala, the brain's alarm center, quiet down. Cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, begins to decrease. Oxytocin increases, creating a sense of bonding and emotional regulation. More than that, the presence of a calm, attuned listener synchronizes heart rate variability between speaker and listener, an indicator of healthy autonomic function. Blood pressure stabilizes, inflammatory markers drop, even the gut microbiome, which is intricately connected to stress and mood, begins to shift toward healthier patterns when a person feels emotionally safe. This isn't metaphor, it's physiology. To be heard is to be healed, not symbolically, but measurably. And the most hopeful part, this is not a gift reserved for the few. Empathy is not magic. It is a biological skill, and like any skill, it can be practiced, strengthened, and shared. Active listening isn't about knowing the right things to say. It's about learning how to be with someone, with patience, without fixing, without fear. Studies show that therapists, doctors, teachers, even strangers can train their nervous systems to co-regulate others simply by changing how they respond. Small shifts in tone, posture, silence, and attention can make all the difference. The goal is not perfection, it's presence. When a child cries and a parent resists the urge to rush in with solutions, and instead just kneels and says, I'm here, the child's nervous system recalibrates. When a patient describes their pain and the doctor pauses, makes eye contact, and says, tell me more, the body responds not just to the words, but to the safety behind them. This kind of listening doesn't require expertise. It requires slowing down, regulating ourselves, and offering space for another person's truth to exist fully and without interruption. The implications of this science reach far beyond personal relationships. They extend to the very systems and institutions that shape our lives. In courtrooms, where judges and juries often overlook the emotional histories behind behavior, trauma-informed approaches that prioritize listening have been shown to reduce recidivism. In classrooms, when teachers validate rather than dismiss student emotions, learning outcomes and behavioral stability improve. In hospitals, patients who feel heard by their doctors are more likely to follow treatment plans, report fewer symptoms, and recover faster. Even in crisis lines and suicide prevention hotlines, the simple act of listening without judgment has repeatedly been shown to save lives. It's not the advice that changes the outcome, it's the attunement. And yet, despite this knowledge, our institutions remain largely untrained in the biology of being heard. Medical schools still focus more on diagnostics than dialogue. Legal systems reward argument over empathy. Schools prize discipline over understanding. But that's beginning to change. As the science becomes clearer, a new language of care is emerging, one that honors what our nervous systems have always known. That presence is powerful, that to listen is to co-regulate, that to be heard is to begin healing. We now know for sure what was once only felt. The biology of listening is real, it is profound, and it holds the power to remake not only individual lives, but the very structures that surround them. Two people sit quietly on a bench. As the sun begins to set behind them, one is speaking slowly, haltingly, about something that has lived heavy in their chest for years. Not a dramatic confession, not a scream for help, just the quiet unraveling of a feeling that never had words before. The other sits still. They aren't nodding excessively or interjecting with advice. They aren't looking at their phone or waiting to speak. They're just there, open, attentive, fully present. There's no urgency, no agenda, just a sense of space, the kind that invites truth. Eventually the speaker pauses. Their voice softens. They take a deeper breath than they have in hours, maybe days. And then, with a look not of relief, but of quiet recognition, they say, "Thank you. I didn't even know I needed that." Maybe that's the mystery, that what we most need doesn't always come in answers or solutions or even comfort, but in the raw, powerful act of being witnessed. Maybe listening isn't really about words at all. Maybe it's about presence, a form of communion older than language, where two nervous systems meet and send a signal older than speech. Asterisk, you exist, you matter, I'm with you. Asterisk, it is this silent, invisible exchange that regulates heartbeats, soothes anxiety, and allows the brain to shift from defense to connection. It's what mothers offer infants long before they can speak. It's what friends give one another in moments of grief. It's what trauma survivors need when memories flood without warning. And it's what we all crave, not just occasionally, but constantly, because our brains were built that way. To be heard is not a luxury. It is a form of survival. A tether for the nervous system that says, asterisk, you are not alone. You are safe here, asterisk. And in a world that so often rushes, interrupts, diagnoses, or dismisses, the gift of true presence is revolutionary. It doesn't demand brilliance or eloquence or perfect timing. It demands something much harder, the willingness to be still, to stay open, and to allow another human being to feel real in our presence. No more, no less. And when we offer that, even briefly, something profound happens. The body begins to heal, not because the pain is gone, but because it is no longer held alone. In that shared silence, where one person listens and another is finally heard, the biology of fear gives way to the biology of connection. And in that shift, a kind of quiet repair begins, ancient, cellular, and deeply human.